put on this computer. And then, of course, so this is on record, like anytime you want it taken down for any reason, whatever, just tell me. And then we'll take down the video. This is not, So just so that's a disclaimer. So let's see. So I think first, I think the best way to start, what I found is like to come up with some questions and then succinct answers, or you can go as long as you want, but to break it up so it's easier to share and consume, right? I find that.
Yeah, I prefer that way of doing it as well.
Yeah, it's sad that it doesn't happen that often, but I think it's really important, especially in scientific discussion. So if there's any questions you think that you would like to be asked, I think, and I'll cut this part out before, but I think you have to sort of understand the strategy. It'll just be a question, and here's the answer, and I can break that up into parts. So I think let's start with that, because I only have a couple questions in mind for you after looking at your work. So is there something that you think is important to be asked of you, like with your particular expertise right now?
Nothing, or just that nothing comes to mind immediately. Let's just see how it goes with what you've come up with.
Okay, cool. So what I think is really cool is that, so the second phase of that study you did on microdosing, where you compared the expectations of what people thought was going to happen and versus what actually happened, against the what the actual results for. So if you could just talk about, let's start with, why is it important to consider expectation when you're thinking about placebos with microdosing?
Yeah, so the time that I did my microdosing study, it was fairly early in the scientific investigation of the phenomenon. When I started collecting data, there really weren't any scientific papers. And now, November 2020, I think there's probably about closing in on 40 or 50 papers on microdosing. So we know much more now than we did a couple of years ago. But yeah, when I was doing this, there wasn't much scientific information. There was a lot of media information, lots of news stories, lots of websites, lots of buzz around microdosing. And so really the motivation for me doing this research was to see if this very positive image that was presented in news and media and online stuff matched with people's actual experiences. And so we weren't able to do a full, randomized placebo-controlled study where we administered microdosing to people. That's complicated for a few reasons that I can get into if you like. But we essentially designed an observational study where we were trying to be as careful and as systematic as we could be, given the sort of bureaucratic constraints that we had. So what that meant was that we, for the main part of our study, found people who were already microdosing and just tracked their experiences very carefully over time. People gave us completed a big battery of measures when they enrolled in the study, and again at the end after 6 weeks. And we also got day-by-day ratings to see what happened day by day. And so that was a way of getting quite good data about what microdosers experienced, but it doesn't really answer the question of why they experienced that. Did they really experience that because of something pharmacological about the microdoses that they were taking, or did they experience those things because of their expectations, their beliefs, magical thinking, something like placebo? So the second part of the study was really to try and answer that question a bit more. And what we did there was we recruited a second sample of microdosers, or people who were interested in microdosing, both of those types of people together, and we asked them what they thought would happen if they were to microdose for 6 weeks. So we essentially gave them questions based on each of the full psychometric measures that we used in the first part of the study, and just asked them to anticipate what they think would happen in each of the psychological domains that we were interested in. And as well as saying whether they thought each of those psychological variables would increase or decrease, we also asked people how confident they were in their estimation. And so based on that, we were able to work out these sort of weighted expectations scores that showed us what were the things that people most expected were going to change, right down to what were the things that people didn't have very strong expectations for. And what we found was overall people did have pretty strong expectations about what microdosing would do. People essentially thought that it would increase all of the positive psychological variables and decrease all of the negative psychological variables. But when we compared the sort of rankings of the things that people had the strongest expectations for with the results from the actual microdoses from the first part of the study, we found that those two things didn't really associate. There was no connection between people's expectations, ranked expectations, and the actual changes that occurred. And that was a really interesting finding for me because, you know, that seemed to indicate that those findings amongst the real microdoses weren't driven entirely or even largely by expectation. So to kind of explain that in another way, one of the things that people had the strongest expectations for were that they thought that microdosing would increase creativity. Now, we didn't actually find any changes in creativity in our study. Some other studies subsequently have reported changes in microdosing, so it's kind of still, I think, an open question of how much microdosing does change creativity. It's actually really hard to measure creativity, so it's a complicated issue anyway. But just coming back to the expectations, based on our data, if we had found a strong increase in creativity, I think it would be very easy for someone to say, well, that's just because that's what people expected was going to happen. But the fact that that didn't occur makes me think that there probably is something going on with at least some of these dimensions we explored. You know, one of the things that we found the largest increase in is this construct called absorption, which is like someone's capacity for intense imaginative experiences. And there was a pretty large increase in absorption amongst our microdoses, but that was not at all something that people had strong expectations about. So it doesn't seem like you can say that that change in absorption is because that's what people really expected was going to happen.
Yeah, that's really what it points to, right? That there's actually seems like there's a pharmacological effect when people are microdosing.
Yeah, I mean that's the way we interpreted our data, and you know, I think despite the fact that we have all this additional evidence now, it's still hard to be really clear about what's going on. You know, I know some other researchers have found strong evidence for placebo effects in microdosing, and I certainly think that expectations do have some role, but I feel like the current sort of question that we need to try and answer as microdosing researchers that we really don't know too well yet is like, really, what are the dimensions where microdosing can be having a very clear pharmacological effect, and what are the areas where whatever effects there are of microdosing is very intermingled with people's expectations and beliefs. It's still quite a quite an unknown set of questions and quite a messy field in that regard.
Yeah. It's when you're dealing with tiny effects, right? That's always going to be the issue, and especially something that's has so much lore, right, in the culture, at least in the U.S., but I imagine also in Australia. Can you speak to anything about the subsequent studies that have come out, what you found interesting in those?
Well, many of the initial studies that came out were retrospective survey-based studies, essentially people asking microdoses about their experience, what they think has happened. And in those studies, people do report quite a range of positive benefits. They report, you know, increases in intention type effects and social type effects and cognition effects, definitely increases in aspects of mental health around reduced depression and stress and those sort of dimensions. And so that, you know, and I think my study also kind of falls into that kind of category of providing this evidence that there are certainly positive effects that are claimed by microdoses. More recently, we've seen some actual lab-based studies where people are given genuine microdoses in well-controlled, randomized settings. And in those studies, the effects seem to be more subtle. A lot of the well-being type effects and the subjective changes in consciousness type effects haven't so far been identified in these lab-based settings. And so that does put a bit of a question mark around what microdosing is actually doing. So there are some kind of findings. One of the first studies found that there was changes in time perception based following microdoses. People experience durations of the interval between two different stimuli is longer. So that is an indication that there is something going on at a cognitive level. And there's been other studies that have looked at brain imaging of people after they've taken microdoses, and they are finding evidence of some brain changes, but these don't seem to be clearly related to the sort of subjective changes that I was mentioning earlier.
So, yeah, I mean, that's super interesting, right? The time perception stuff is very subtle, and it probably doesn't have these cascade effects. Like it's not responsible for all these positive reports. Or is that, we don't know.
It's not obviously responsible for those sorts of changes. We don't have good evidence for that stuff at this stage. One thing that's quite interesting, a very recent study that has just come out was a dose finding study looking at the dose of LSD required for people to experience different kinds of effects. And one of the striking things in that study was just how much variability there is between people. It certainly seems like there are big differences into how much people respond to microdosing, and that may be part of the complicated story of what's going on. Like it seems plausible that there are a subset of individuals who really do experience quite dramatic changes in response to microdosing, and then there are other people who maybe aren't as sensitive or don't respond in the same way. And so that makes it much harder to identify group level changes if there really are these, predispositions amongst some people to experience effects, whereas others don't.
So that's super interesting, and this variability that people would have different experiences, based off a microdose. Like, is there any way, or is there a methodology that could tease those out, like to pre-screen or something like that? Do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, there's nothing that we know so far. I mean, there has been a little bit of work with high-dose psychedelics trying to find, like, what are the predictors of whether someone's going to have a good experience or a negative experience. And so that line of work certainly could be adapted to microdosing. I talked earlier about one of the main findings from my earlier research was we found this increase in absorption amongst microdoses. I think absorption, like baseline levels of absorption, would also probably be a good candidate for the degree to which microdosing might work. That's not really a very well tested idea. It's a bit speculative, but we do know from other research that absorption does seem to predict the degree to which someone, for example, experiences an altered state of consciousness in a religious setting. It can predict how likely someone is to respond to hypnotic suggestion and those kinds of things. So it seems like that would be an interesting candidate. That's certainly something that I'm interested in exploring.
That's really cool. So absorption, and then, so how would one figure out their baseline for absorption? Or is that something you can't do if you're like a...
No, we measure it with a psychometric scale. So there's a standardized set of questions that you can answer, and that gives you a score, a number that quantifies the degree of absorption that a person has, and it's sort of like a trait characteristic, like something like a personality trait.
Okay, so let me see here if there's anything that. Yeah. Okay, that's super. This is great. Yeah. I mean, I can't think of anything else as it relates to microdosing. I guess, except for just future directions. Like, what are you excited about? Like, if you were given funding right now, what would you study? That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I think the interesting directions for microdosing is what I mentioned before, trying to tease apart, like, what are the domains that are most likely to have some kind of effect for microdosing. It's a really I think it's really important to work out what's going on here. You know, like there's on the one hand lots of sort of just general public interest in microdosing. It's become a really popular concept, and there are certainly lots of people out there doing it. And on the one hand, if people are microdosing and from their own point of view experiencing benefits and it's working, then that's great. But I think it is important to understand why it's working, and if it's working because of something to do with the mindset of those people, or if it is working because of something mechanistic about the way these very low doses of psychedelics operate in the brain. It's two kind of interesting possibilities. And so, yeah, I think it's important to try and understand what's going on there. It is a tricky area to study because, like you said, probably many of these effects are going to be small effects. And so it's hard to have measures that are going to be sensitive, perhaps, to the types of changes that we need to pick up for microdosing. And there is this huge confound of people's motivations to get into microdosing. You know, a lot of the people that respond to particularly the survey-based research are probably people who are fans of microdosing and believe that it works well. And so that may mean that their experiences aren't representative of what's happening for everyone. So the way to answer those sorts of questions is by more lab-based studies. Something that we've got on the horizon is a neuroimaging study where we're going to look at what's happening in the brains of people on days when they're actually microdosing and on days when they've taken a placebo. See if we can identify any differences there. There's kind of a set of similar studies taking part in different labs around the world, looking at comparable sorts of questions along these lines for different substances and for different kind of dosing regimes as well. So I think that's an exciting development. Yeah, that's kind of where I see the next kind of steps.
Nice. So if I could summarize, it's domain. So like what sort of like well-being or mindfulness or absorption or something like that. People, like what maybe something like pre-screening, like what maybe predispose someone to have these effects, like, and then the sort of fMRI type of studies to just look like what is actually going on in the brain when people.
So I guess the third category there is kind of looking at the mechanisms and the effects, what's actually causing the changes that we see. So yeah, that's a nice kind of summary, looking at like what is the range of effects, what are the indicators that someone is more or less likely to benefit or to have some change, and then how is this working?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, this is awesome. I mean, really, thank you for taking the time to just explain what you've done so far and like just where you see the field. And yeah, I guess would you consider being a speaker at our conference? Do you ever make it out this way?
I mean, at the moment, no one seems to be making it much of anyway. We've got like really, all our airports are like heavily locked down. We can't travel really. I mean, I think we can travel, but we can't really come back very easily if we travel. So probably not in the immediate future, but yeah, absolutely would be open to taking part if there is an opportunity.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, I don't alone make those decisions, of course, but I think you fit really well. I mean, we need more of this serious psychedelic science in general, right? Like the sober science. And I think in particular microdosing, because it is harder to study. It is probably more popular or becoming more popular. And there's not going to be a lot of pharmaceutical companies banking on that or backing that research, right? Because
well, I mean, there are a number of startups that do seem to be interested in microdosing, and particularly looking at whether microdosing may be an effective adjunct to different kinds of therapies. So that there is some interest from some of the big psychedelic companies and also from some of the startups. I think it's probably not as a hot topic as high dose psychedelic therapies, but yeah, there is some interest in it, and I think that's part of the reason why it's really important to get the answers right about what's going on here. You know, like it seems like there is risk that the hype could lead to sort of a self-fulfilling situation where people get more and more excited about microdosing when perhaps some of what's going on can be explained by other factors as well.
Yeah, yeah. And so is that Compass? Is that the startup that's
I
interested?
can't remember if Compass actually has a microdosing trial planned. Yeah, look, I don't know off the top of my head.
Oh, okay. Yeah, to look into that. I wasn't aware that there were, but that's well, I guess that's good news. Then maybe some money would be coming for more research, which is great. Yeah. Well, thanks again. If there's anything else you want to add, or if there's any way that the conscious hacking community, do you have an ask? Do you have like a study that you're recruiting for or anything?
Not well. I mean, we will be recruiting for this study in Sydney, Australia, coming up. So yeah, I've got like just a sign up form on my website if people are interested in what we're doing, and I'll send out information when we are recruiting.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, that's probably, I don't know, probably a small part of your audience, but yeah.
Yeah, I think there is a branch in Sydney, like a small
okay.
meetup, but I don't think it's much. But yeah, if it can move the needle just a tad, then
sure.
And that remains open too. If you ever think that there's a way that community that we
okay,
can help.
Thanks. Yeah, certainly I can imagine in the future having projects that would be looking for international responses and stuff like that. So that's handy there.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Well, thank you again for taking the time, and I hope just more studies are in the pipeline in the future, and I get to talk to you again.
Thank you. It's really nice to meet you. I'd be really curious to see how this turns out and to see what the other researchers say as well. So if you're able to send me a link once it's up, that would be excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that for sure.
All right. Thanks, mate. You have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Cheers.
See you. Bye.
Bye.